Development challenges in the Asia and the Pacific region are becoming more complex. Past development problems such as income inequality, groundwater depletion, and quality of education remain intractable. Old solutions no longer suffice. New challenges have also emerged, such as rapid urbanization, climate change, and rising incidence of non-communicable diseases, to name a few. Innovation involves encouraging new ideas and putting promising concepts to the test. Venturing into the new and unknown is risky, and the payoff is rarely immediate. While the goals of innovation might be well defined, the path to achieving them is less clear. Little is known about what will work, where, under what conditions, how, and with whom. Value comes from activities that are able to make breakthroughs, as well as from learning from failures and successes. Taking risks and accepting missteps are part of experimenting with innovations. Also important is the critical role that country, institutional, and policy contexts play in shaping the impact of innovation on society. Many traditional evaluation methods, however, tend to inhibit rather than encourage innovation. How can we deal with these issues? Given a dynamic and complex development context, how can the role of evaluation in learning and accountability motivate or not motivate greater innovation in operations? What evaluation techniques are suited for assessing innovation in operations? What can the experiences of multilateral and bilateral organizations offer in encouraging innovation in public and private sector operations? In what ways can evaluators fill the role of a strategic learning partner in innovative programs and projects? Evaluation helps in the formation of policies and actions. But as evaluation becomes more influential, we face ever tougher challenges regarding methods, approaches, and application. Evaluation must meet these challenges on a continuing basis to seize the many opportunities to help shape policy and practice.
For our session on evaluation and innovation, now I call to stage the panelists, Professor Bob Picciotto, Evaluator General Rakesh Nangia, Director General Kaichik Moroka, and Chief Evaluator Joseph Eichenberger. And I invite the moderator for the session, Director Rachel Magier. She has been the Director of Evaluation Department of the Council of European Development Bank since 2009. Prior to that, she was serving the bank for 20 years in the operations departments. Before joining the CEB, she was at the OECD. She has contributed to many workshops and published many papers, especially in the financial sector. So, Rachel, the floor is yours.
Hello? Is it working? Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Mala introduced the topic of the session. She even labeled it the backbone of the conference, which puts a very heavy responsibility on everybody's shoulders here. And she also highlighted the topic and focus of this session, which is evaluation and innovation. And the two indicative questions are the role of evaluation as a strategic learning partner in innovative projects, and a reflection perhaps on some evaluation techniques to assess innovation. This morning's panel said a lot of the key issues that are related to development challenges that we face today, and I'm sure they will crop up in the presentations that each one of our panelists will make. The format of the session will follow that was done previously before lunch. So I would like to start by introducing our panelists. Professor Bob Picciotto is currently visiting professor at the International Development Institute in King's College London, and previously he was Vice President of Corporate Planning and Budget at the World Bank, as well as former Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group. He's a member of the Academy of Social Sciences, and he now serves on the boards of the United Kingdom Evaluation Society and the European Evaluation Society. Rakesh Nangia is Vice President and Evaluator General of Independent Development Evaluation at the African Development Bank. And prior to that, he was Director of Strategy and Operations for Human Development Network at the World Bank, where he also served in many other different capacities, including Acting Vice President for the World Bank Institute. Keiichi Muraoka is Director General of the Evaluation Department of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. And he has been appointed to numerous management positions in the agency before, also serving as Director General of the Kyushu International Center and Deputy Director General of the Public Policy and Administration Department. And finally, Joe Eichenberger was appointed Chief Evaluator of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 2011. Before this, he served as Vice President of Regional and Country Operations and Policy at the African Development Bank, and he was also Vice President for Operations at ADB, having joined the ADB from the Treasury Department, where he was Director of the Office of Multilateral Development Banks. I will pass the floor first to you, Bob, and each of you has 7 minutes. I have my professional flag wavers in the front row to keep you on time, and so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. But before my 7 minutes start, I would like to give tribute to Vinod Thomas for his leadership in evaluation, particularly in highlighting the independence of the function and the importance of the independence of the function. And this assembly really demonstrates the tremendous convening power he has been able to generate. Well, 7 minutes. Less is more. If I only had 1 minute for this presentation, I would say 2 things. First, innovation needs evaluation for a simple reason. I mean, new is not always good, and good is not always new. And in a way, this is what the president of the ADB said this morning. There are some basic things about development which innovation does not capture. Secondly, evaluation itself needs innovation for a simple reason, because the world has changed and the evaluation has not changed fast enough. Now, let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, innovation is a fad. And the development business is plagued by fads, adjustment, integrated rural development, you name it. Now, what is a fad? You recognize a fad if Bill Gates talks about it, Davos, and OECD. And this is the case here. Everybody talks about innovation. I mean, we used to think about innovation as technological change. Now it's everything. I mean, the new OECD strategy talks about innovation in terms of changes in social approaches of public sector reform. Even imitation, creative imitation, is classified as innovation. So it is viewed essentially as the road to development utopia. But the reality is different. What does theory tell us about innovation? Well, until the new growth theory of Paul Romer kicked in, we used to think of development and growth as a matter of resource endowment, capital output ratios, and technology was a residual. Now, now we have human capital and innovation at the core of the development process, which in a way makes a lot of sense, because it's a public good, it has huge spillover effects, and so there is nothing wrong with innovation, but it has a dark side. And Schumpeter, highlighted the fact that innovation essentially is creative destruction. I mean, innovation can be a public good, but it can also be a public bad. A lot of the financial innovations were behind the 2008 financial crisis. But more fundamentally, any innovation will make the existing capital stock redundant. Take the motor car. I mean, the motor car, which is great innovation, it creates 51 million casualties a year. And at the same time, it made the huge capital stock investment in railways redundant. And of course, the railways that made the waterways redundant. So, in other words, there are costs and benefits in innovation. I think we need to highlight this. In addition to that, at the firm level, innovation is pitiless. Remember Kodak? Great company, tremendous loyalty, just disappeared from one day to the next. I mean, and of course, a lot of workers get laid off and all the rest. So let's be clear, therefore, that innovation needs evaluation. Even at the macro level, it's hard to see a clear link between technological change and productivity. Robert Solow once quipped, you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So innovation deserves evaluation. Now, in addition to that, the enabling environment for innovation needs evaluation. And one doesn't hear too much about that. But the fact of the matter is that patents are turning essentially a public good into a private good. Patents are monopolies, basically. Take even the James Watt steam engine patent, delayed innovation, the development of steam engines for for ships and for railways by decades. Patents freeze innovation and delay the advance of new technologies, as well as, of course, reward the creators of the innovation. At the country level, TRIPS is supposed, at the global level, supposed to allow special and differential treatment to developing countries. In reality, a lot of the bilateral trade agreements are pushing down very rigid intellectual property legislation down the throat of developing countries. So clearly, we do need to evaluate the enabling framework for innovation. It's not enough to promote innovation. In particular, Ravi mentioned this morning the issue of inequality. And I think one question which has to be asked when we're evaluating innovation is what impact does it have on inequality, for example. Of course, Schumpeter was challenged by Kuznets, who invented the inverted U-curve. Basically, the idea was that market forces by themselves will reduce inequality after inequality increases, as we heard this morning from China. But the fact of the matter is the reason that the U-curve declines has been essentially social legislation, not the magic of the market. So yes, innovation policy needs independent evaluation. It follows that when you evaluate innovation, you have to do it at two levels, at the global level as well as at the country level. The fact of the matter is that the quality of the global environment, it is whether you have an open trade system or not, or free movement of capital, that will give you high rewards for innovation. However, the risks are much greater if the country does not have the adaptive capacity to absorb innovation, and which is why special and differential treatment is important. So clearly, one has to look in terms of risk management, whether or not, you have a 2x2 matrix, which I would have presented if I used a PowerPoint, which shows that depending on the quality of the global environment and the country environment, you have either high risk, low reward, low risk, low reward, and so forth and so on. So much for the first proposition that innovation needs to be evaluated. Let us now turn to the second part of the argument, which that evaluation itself needs innovation. And let's start at the project level. The project is the workhorse of the development business. And it deals with the real economy, and it's like the torchlights in the forest, like Jim Wolfensohn used to say. So the importance of the projects are many. So one should not feel that projects are a low form of intervention. Now, ideally, as Alexia mentioned this morning, we should build innovation into projects. The World Bank, and disclosure, I recommended it, adopted a learning and innovation loan, some time ago. And well, when Jim Wolfensohn just came in, he asked Vice President, do you have any ideas of how to make the place better? And I suggested learning and innovation loan. And he agreed with it, and this instrument was, but the fact of the matter, it was, despite what we heard this morning, this instrument has been abolished, and so it was a failed innovation, and the question remains, why was this the case, given the importance of making projects essentially into policy experiments which are eventually upscaled. Now, what can we do specifically to improve the quality of project evaluation in terms of innovation? First of all, I would argue that we should put the Paris Declaration criteria as an integral part of the evaluation criteria, because the benefits of a project are only valid at the country level. And therefore, to avoid the macro-micro disconnect, you really do need to have a sense of implementing the Paris Declaration, ownership, alignment, harmonization, results orientation, mutual accountability. All of these things are not necessarily built into projects today. And I think to make innovation work and spread, then I think we need to evaluate projects with those Paris Declaration criteria in mind, which is not the case today in the MDBs. Secondly, I would argue that we should emulate IFAD, and IFAD evaluates creativity and innovation as a separate indicator for projects. I think that would be a very useful thing to do, and that, of course, implies also assessing upscaling potential, which, you know, this whole upscaling question that Brookings has done so much work about. Johannes Lehn and Romy Karas have done a lot of work in this area, because we will not reach the Sustainable Development Goals unless these development interventions are upscaled. At the country level, how to evaluate innovation policy, I think we have a lot of league tables today. And in particular, I would point out there is something called the Global Innovation Index, which this index does is taking the OECD innovation policy and essentially derives indicators from this policy. And I think it's a pretty good set of, it's a good way, a good program theory to use to evaluate innovation policy at the country level. But, as I think Vinod said this morning, we should not confuse innovation as the end, it's simply an output, because the ultimate outcome is essentially the Sustainable Development Goals, which the only ones which have legitimacy. Innovation in itself, despite all the fads and the rhetoric, should not be viewed as an end in itself. The inclusive development is the goal. Now, quickly, methodologically, you know, the bar for quality in evaluation has been raised since the austerity period. And I think now there is this rush to randomized controlled trials, which are really quite a narrow aspect of evaluation. I think the fact of the matter is that the evaluation profession has moved way beyond what the MDBs do today in evaluation. I mean, it's not enough to rate projects or rate country strategies and do thick description. I think one needs to embrace complexity theory, systems thinking, the whole question of mixed methods. How do we mix those methods? And I think the point which Alexia made this morning is fundamental. We need to really marry monitoring and evaluation to get evaluation in real time, which, by the way, is not the responsibility of the independent evaluation department. It is really the responsibility of the self-evaluation system of management and the interface with the independent evaluation, which would make a difference. And that's what is called in the lingo developmental evaluation. So we need to merge Michael Patton developmental evaluation with development evaluation. Finally, we need to bring in the global policy aspects, which are viewed as exogenous, but which should be endogenized in our assessments. And finally, we need to take account of the fact that given shifting wealth patterns, we need to review the whole way of the governance of evaluation in development has to be rethought. We have a new development architecture. You know, the fact 75% of the poor people are in middle-income countries today, which really means, and these countries have the resource to deal with poverty, which means that development evaluation has got to focus on capacity building in countries. That is where the high leverage is. It is not simply an add-on to what independent evaluation departments do. It should become It should come at the core of what development evaluation departments do, because in the end, it's what middle-income countries, how they evaluate their own programs, which will make a difference to the poor of the world. So in conclusion, as people in would say innovation, schwinnovation, as people from Brooklyn would say, innovation, schwinnovation. And evaluators, please evaluate yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for your valuable insights, particularly the distinction that innovation is the output and sustainable development goals are the outcome, because there tends to be some confusion at times. I'll pass the floor next to Rakesh. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rochelle, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the graveyard shift, as we call it. And I know that Mala yesterday was reminding us constantly about the 7-minute rule. I'd be blessed if I can keep you awake for the 7 minutes. Let me begin and use a very similar framework to what Bob was putting out. I'll begin perhaps with a twist. I'll begin with defining innovation. Because we heard extremes. We heard the idea of paper clips from Alexia, and the steam engine, which is the other extreme, from Bob. Then I will move on to the second part, which is what Bob was talking about. Do evaluations encourage, discourage, or do nothing for innovation? And third, is there any innovation happening within evaluation itself? And how can we support that? So let's perhaps begin with the first one, the definitional part. The way I would look at it is better solutions to meet existing or new challenges at lower cost. A simple enough definition. And what I'll do is try and illustrate this with an example. We have Ebola, which is not just the news, and it is widespread or increasing very quickly in West Africa. It's not the first time that we as a humanity are struck by a virus which is deadly. Let's keep in mind there was H5N1 or bird flu several years ago. There was H1N1 a couple of years ago. All of these have lessons for us. Let's imagine that there is a company which actually invents or finds or discovers a drug which can take care of Ebola and cure the patients. This I would call the technological component of innovation. It differs slightly from invention, which is the James Watt's steam engine model. And I would argue that we as development professionals do not necessarily have all the technical expertise to do the invention side. But we do have the innovative side, which is to use existing inventions and move forward on a technological level as well. The second part, so now we have a drug. Now the second part comes in, and we say, how can we, as development professionals, identify getting this drug to the right people? It could be in the form of a vaccine, which is preventive, or it could be a drug which is curative. You could look at approaches. So this morning, I heard a gentleman talking about participatory approaches. And that approach itself, how we get to the patients who need it, could be considered innovative. The third part becomes institutional, which I would align with implementation. You now have a drug, you know where it has to go, and now you need to take this drug to the people who need it. And that would be your institutional mechanisms necessary to reach that. So in sum, the way I would look at defining innovation is looking at it either at a technological level, or an approach level, or an institutional level. And any one of these three, or a combination of those, would work out very well from a development perspective that we are looking at. Let's keep in mind that doing the same thing quicker may not necessarily translate to innovation. This morning, President talked about reforms in procurement. Now, the reforms part would work well, but if I, as a good task manager, move forward on the same principles and cut short the procurement time from 6 months to 3 months, that does not necessarily translate into innovation. So we covered that part of it. Let's look at, do evaluations encourage innovation? 2 parts. This morning we heard, and we all know, that the role of evaluation is both on the accountability side and the learning side. So you could argue that one of the roles that evaluation should play is learning. So you pull out lessons from everywhere else, promote innovation, and move forward. And therefore, evaluation has an important role to play in innovation. I would argue that this is like pushing on a string. Trying to get evaluation to actually promote innovation in an institution is going to be extremely difficult. I can't read those 2 minutes, but I will come around very quickly. Is like pushing on a string. So let's not even try to think of how evaluation can do this. But it can work together with other institutional sides. So I'll give you an example of EFAD. And Ashwani is here, and he can also corroborate when I go off track. EFAD instituted a very explicit innovation component in its policy. It has an innovation policy. And it went forward and said, we are going to ensure that focusing on rural poverty, we use innovative ways in reducing and addressing this challenge. Evaluation came in later, I think, 4 years ago, and did an evaluation of how well that policy of innovation had been implemented. So the two worked together. The overall direction was provided by management, which is the leadership part, and the evaluation component went forward and helped it along. So the way I would liken this is to say, as evaluators, we do not create products, we help make the products better by telling them what is working, what is not working, and so on. And similarly here, if indeed innovation is supposed to be an integral part of how we are going to be moving forward as development institutions, the principal role of defining that comes forward with management. And evaluators can then come in and support and help move this forward. If anybody wants to know a little more about the learning and innovative loan instrument at the World Bank that Bob mentioned, I'm one of the victims of that, and I can tell you how it would not work. Jim Wolfenson did not change many things, including how these little loans were supposed to still follow bank procurement and financial management policies and so on, but also he did not change the managers who were very resistant to new ideas. Last, innovation and evaluation. Keeping in mind that we as agencies are fairly independent, we have a great deal of flexibility to bring about innovation in evaluation. Unfortunately, I would submit that we haven't done that either. There is a huge amount of things that we could be doing at a methodological level, at a technological level, and so on. Let's take an example of cell phones that Sanjay was talking about this morning. A great deal of information is available through those cell phones. Let's say we are tracking poverty, incidence of poverty. What we find is that as cell phones are charged, in terms of SIM cards being extra cash and so on, as they're charged, they are charged more frequently and in smaller amounts in densely populated and poor areas. So the tracking of this, as soon as you see the frequency coming down and the size of the charge going up, you know that there are changes that are happening there. Similarly, a colleague this morning talked about how to track medicines in hospitals and bringing civil society into it. Simple mechanism. Getting data is not just expensive, but extremely difficult. One of the techniques that has been used, and we should be using that much more, is to have little surveys on cell phones which can be filled in by civil society and simply give them a small amount of money, 10 cents on filling in a survey onto their phone. Again, very inexpensive, but mechanisms which we can use innovatively to get the basic data which we desperately need for doing evaluations. So let me stop there, and thank you once again.
Thank you, Rakesh. Keiichi, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me associate myself with the previous speakers on congratulating the 10th anniversary of the Independent Evaluation Department of Asian Development Bank. It is an honor and privilege for me to be given this opportunity to address this distinguished group of academia, policymakers, and development experts and international donors. I wish to thank the ADB Independent Evaluation Department for organizing this fabulous forum on the innovation and learning in changing Asia. Today, I'm going to speak about knowledge management for the innovation by utilizing lessons learned from evaluation. First of all, to begin with, please allow me to introduce the text of classic literature on innovation and knowledge management. Peter Drucker wrote, "Purposeful, systematic innovation begins with analysis of source of new opportunities." And Ikujiro Nonaka defined the business process of the knowledge-creating company, whose sole business is continuous innovation. Following presentation is inspired by their ideas. JICA, as a single implementation body of Japanese ODA, including technical cooperation, capital grant assistance, and loan, faces increasing demand for further strengthening the PDCA cycle and enhance the quality of project delivery. Evaluation is expected to play an important role to improve the project management as well as the accountability to stakeholders. In order to meet these expectations, Evaluation Department of JICA commissioned the thematic evaluation on analysis on the improvement of management system for utilizing lesson learned in PDCA cycle in 2013. The recommendation of the thematic evaluation is as follows. To promote knowledge management, lessons learned from evaluation should be classified, analyzed, then appropriately communicated to the project departments. Lessons learned should be processed into highly versatile and practical knowledge, then authorized for accumulation. Verify the use of effectiveness of the lesson learned in project PDCA cycle and feedback the result. The process overlap with what Dr. Donaka described in his knowledge creation model as to translate tacit knowledge into practical knowledge in its socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization cycle. By the way, the thematic evaluation analyzed the constraint of JICA's utilization of lessons learned. It points out that important lessons learned has not authorized and has not applied in standardized practices. As a result, similar lessons are repeatedly produced, thus to create same mistakes and same countermeasures are reinvented. I think this is a big risk factor for the JICA's management. The evaluation pointed out 5 issues that causes insufficient use of lessons learned, such as, practical use of knowledge management, access to the information, solution, user motivation, and feedback from the user. I suspect evaluation department of any organization may find same challenges. Based on those findings, following proposal was submitted in light of improving process management, process of knowledge management, and use of lesson learned. There are 7 processes newly introduced. The step 1, extract lesson from evaluation result, project implementation, and monitoring. Step 2, classify the lesson learned, then verbal feedback to the result. This April, we have conducted series of seminars inviting 200 staff, including overseas network, and tried to direct feedback of the evaluation result. And analysis and processing by expert, not only the evaluation staff, but also we ask our expert team on thematic area or sector group to be involved in the process of bringing up the versatile and practical evaluation result, lesson learned. And then authorization and certification for the concrete use of the result. And amass in one database for easy access. On this point, I got the inspiration that ADB has a very good database for evaluation. And drawing lesson learned to routine procedures. The process of knowledge management is indispensable for knowledge creation in JICA. And it is hoped that new knowledge leads to creation, innovation. Taking this opportunity, let me add 2 more approaches to bring innovation. The JICA is expected to enhance evidence-based management for improving quality of project innovation. Innovative intervention be evaluated by impact evaluation to scale up new intervention. Setting standard indicators is another approach to improve the quality of a project. It aims to improve the quality of project planning when be used at the project formulation and ex-ante evaluation stage. Conclusion. Let me conclude my remark by quoting the original question from the organizer of the forum. How evaluator can be a strategic partner in innovative program and project? My answer is that to be innovative, evaluation should be positioned as an essential part of knowledge management. Through continuous process of knowledge management in PDCA cycle, lesson learned from evaluation can sure to lead to the innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keiichi, and for sharing the experience of JICA on knowledge management for innovation using lessons learned from evaluation. And that serves as a good illustration of the point that Rakesh made prior to you, which was that evaluators don't create products, but they help make them better. The floor now goes to Joe.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you, Vinod and colleagues, for your kind invitation. I left Manila in 2006. I came here in 2001, and as I return here, one of the things I reflect on is how much less I realize I know now than I thought I knew when I came in 2001. So my apologies to all of you for that. As I reflected on the task for this panel, my mind returned to a story that a colleague of mine told me, a colleague who spent many years working in a very large multilateral development institution, which will remain unnamed, but which is located directly across from the IMF in Washington, D.C. And he's a very thoughtful guy, and he told me this story of a cycle in the World Bank where where people who were planning and developing individual projects, designing individual projects, would basically be invited to make a presentation before a very substantial, heavy, high-level panel of very worthy senior World Bank people. And the process went something like, you come into the room and you're invited to present your idea for a project. But basically, you're being told, dazzle me. We want to be dazzled. Come in here, young man or young woman, and show us your brilliance with this project design. Essentially competing for resources and competing for the attention of these senior officers inside the bank. I don't know how much of that was apocryphal, but surely something like that goes on. And my mind returned to that as I was thinking about the challenge of innovation in these organizations, and also about the challenge of how evaluation might relate to that. And I have a few observations about innovation, somewhat flowing from them, and then a few observations about evaluation I think I've learned maybe over the years. The first is that story, it seems to me, suggests, and I believe, that there is innovation going on. There is innovation going on all the time. These institutions are full of capable, dedicated, hardworking people who are trying their best to bring solutions to problems about which they feel very deeply. I think that's a fair conclusion. But I think there's another piece to it, perhaps, and maybe this is my cynicism. There's another piece to it, perhaps, which is I think that it suggests there's also a very real danger that innovation may actually be just another term for ever-growing complexity. And innovation can also mean hang as many new bells and whistles as you possibly can upon this relatively plain vanilla project in order to impress people, and possibly in order to make it more complex than it really is. There's a fair amount of phony innovation, I think, that goes on, but it's presented, I think, as something perhaps more than it is, and I think there's a real danger of that. And the third point, to me, is I think it's a legitimate question to ask, who does this serve? And during the course of the day, that question has actually been asked, our initial panel and the panel here. Who are we really serving? Innovation for what purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? And it feels to me that, in a way, that's where the evaluation challenge comes in. And I think that's where the principal obligation of the evaluators lies, and where our talents, I think, best serve us. So in that context, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what that might say about evaluation, and perhaps leave you with some perspectives that come from me, having been for a time a board member and then a member of senior management and now an evaluator trying to make some sense of all this. I would argue here that evaluation is a relatively simple thing. It's some sort of a systematic, basically evidence-based assessment of what happened relative to what we thought was going to happen. I think that's fairly straightforward. The question, did it work, is, it seems to me, innovation neutral. You don't need to have a view on whether this project was cutting edge or whether it was plain vanilla to be able to answer the question, did it work relative to what it set out to do? That's an innovation neutral kind of question, and it feels to me that's the question primarily evaluators ought to be asking. To me, it's very difficult to see how or why well done evaluation would either penalize or reward any particular type of project design, whether it was yesterday's design or a highly creative new design. I don't understand that. So I think I would possibly differ a little bit with Bob on this, in that I'm not sure that evaluators are smart enough to be able to develop a set of criteria against which we can judge that Project A is demonstrably more innovative than Project B. I'm just not sure we can see that. So let me suggest a couple of ways, though, and I think there may be important ways in which evaluation can contribute to better and more innovation in the institutional context within which it operates. And some of these will be I think, stunningly self-evident, but maybe worth saying anyhow. First, it's establishing standards of evaluability. What are the data that we expect to see? What are the metrics that we're using? Many projects, frankly, don't rise to this standard. The second is, and this is critical, is to capture the lines of causality, or the so-called theory of change, very clearly in the project design. What is it that you expect your activities or your inputs to cause to happen that will lead to some desirable result? I have to say, from my experience in management and in assessing projects, many times you will see a project proposal which says, we intend to provide financing in this amount, technical assistance in this amount, it's going to be channeled through this particular recipient, and then magic will happen, and then and the result will be something that will be better. And all too often, there's a failure to describe with clarity what is that line of causality. What are the features of the effect of this transaction that we expect to see? And I would argue that this is the embedded knowledge that Rogier referred to earlier. It's that the knowledge of the staff in designing the project to say, this is what we expect to happen. And then that becomes something that's evaluable. The evaluators can come back ex post and see whether that occurred. And I think that's a critically important feature of capturing the embedded institutional knowledge that exists with the individuals inside the organization. Third point is, I believe that the evaluation functions in all these institutions could significantly deepen their role in internal learning and knowledge generation. It's actually a relatively recent feature of evaluation that evaluators even regarded themselves as having a learning function. The function had always been rooted in accountability, and it was rooted in accountability in large part because there was a lack of trust. There was a lack of trust between boards and management about what was stated to be happening was actually happening. So the evaluators themselves have much more that they can do to deepen their role in knowledge management, producing more synthetic material based on experience, looking more deeply into the causal relationships that we believe exist but may not exist. Fourth point is for the evaluation departments to become more outward-looking. Bob alluded to this. It's quite striking, it seems to me, it's quite striking that the difference between the techniques of evaluation as typically practiced inside these organizations and what is going on outside these organizations. There are evaluative techniques that are being used in the private sector, for example, or in other public organizations from which we could learn a great deal. We evaluators need to be more outward-looking as a way of contributing to innovation inside the organization. Additional point is, I think we need to be absolutely militant on the imperative of effective self-evaluation inside the organizations. Effective self-evaluation. The project teams looking with rigor and honesty at exactly what happened relative to what was expected to happen, and to have incentive structures and reward structures inside the organizations built along that. I know that there are many, many examples, and everyone in this room could say, where new projects are being designed with little more than a passing glance at the experience of other projects. And it feels to me that that's leaving a huge amount of value on the table. And the evaluation departments, I think, can assist the institutions and management to tap into that by ourselves being more rigorous about the need for good self-evaluation. The final point is that we also have a role in sort of process evaluations, in evaluating internal practices. What actually happens as part of the project development process here? To what degree is there a rigorous upstream assessment of experience? And how effectively is that being fed back in? I'm struck at the EBRD, a large and very sophisticated institution, the number of times where a transaction proposal will be brought to the board where the team hasn't even bothered to look at the experience with the previous transaction. And I can't imagine any commercial bank out there accepting that, where a loan officer comes in and says, I'm going to make another loan to this client, we've already done business with it, but I'm not able to tell you how effective the previous loan was. I simply can't imagine that happening. And yet, it does happen on a regular basis. So these are relatively simple things. We as evaluators, I think, can do more of working in concert with management. The final point I would just say is there is immense value in the independent role of evaluations. It is not to be, it's not to be trifled with. It must be protected. There's no question about that. However, I do think that there are times when the independence becomes a fetish, and when it prevents us from working in a more collegial and integrated way with project teams, with management, and importantly, with boards. So those are some ideas for possible ways evaluators can contribute to innovation, short of being innovators themselves with respect to project design. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I believe we are within our time frame, so now we do have some time for interaction within the panel. I don't know if any of you have a particular reaction to what one or the other may have wanted to, well, have said. Does anybody want to take the floor?
Yes, no, I wanted to go back to the question of how can we evaluate creativity and innovation. Can we do that in the evaluation departments? You know, going back to IFAD, you know, IFAD essentially has an approach which distinguishes between the facilitation role of innovation, where you take a local innovation and spread it around. And that is what Albert Hirschman called trait-taking. When in the 60s, he visited World Bank projects and wrote his book on development projects observed. And so he distinguished between trait-taking and trait-making. Trait-making is when, under IFAD semantics, it's called promotion role. So you distinguish the facilitation role and the promotion role. And that means importing a technology, importing a process which is not there. And so it's really the ratio between facilitation and promotion, which is the art of design of projects in terms of innovation. And there is, of course, no magical rule. It's not that trait-taking is better than trait-making, but clearly trait-making is much riskier than trait-taking. Because if you take a local innovation, for example, I remember working on Operation Flood in India, where it started in Gujarat and then it spread to the rest of the country. So it's not something that the World Bank invented. It's something which was developed in India and which the World Bank simply helped to spread. So that was a case of facilitation. You know, bringing in new technologies can also be very powerful, but you know, the question of how to assess risk, that's really the art. And of course, the key question Vinod wanted us to address is, you know, to what extent should evaluation encourage, you know, responsible risk management rather than risk aversion? And I would argue that this is a very important question for evaluators, to be sure that when we evaluate the performance of the institution, even if the project has failed, quote unquote, it may be an honorable failure, which we can learn a lot about. I don't know if it's true, that out of a failed USAID project in petrochemical in Korea, Korea was able to develop a very highly successful industry in that area, learning the lessons of experience. So that's the point I want to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle, and interesting points, Bob. I'd like to touch upon something that you mentioned, Joe, especially in the context of this large MDB hidden somewhere in Washington. Um, Moving away from this razzle-dazzle approach, which unfortunately still exists and is quite widespread, to one of a practical one is a real cultural shift that has to take place. And cultural shifts, as we know, not just take time, but are extremely difficult to manage. And this is not one of those things where it happens only from the top. It is a gradual process, it takes time and so on. How best can we, as from the evaluation side, help a little spur in this direction? I think learning from each other has to be an imperative, something that you pointed out, KG, and it somehow does not seem to happen as much as we like to talk about it. So the South-South dialogues and connecting the dots and wonderful phrases have come up, but honestly, the real learning is not happening, not even over the coffee that Roger mentioned about. One of the things that I would like to suggest is, at least as on the evaluation community side, to see how some other institutions are looking at this. And I discussed at length with our colleagues in IFAD on some of the things that they have tried to do here. Now, we all know that evaluation specifically looks at the core elements of any evaluation are relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability. What IFAD did was saying, okay, this is the project, this is what we are going to give the overall rating for the project on this. But we will have an innovation flag, and we'll decide on how we evaluate the innovation part of it, but it'll be below the line, so it doesn't affect the overall rating of a project. But it does get reported on. Just like we have monitoring evaluation flags. Let's keep in mind that before safeguards and so on became so important, years ago, before it became policy, this was ignored completely. And then the monitoring and evaluation side also started to gain steam and so on. So I think we do have a role to play, but we can't play it alone. It has to be together with the other side also joining forces on this.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Picciotto mentioned about the risk management in terms of evaluation. I'd like to evaluate my presentation about the risk management, how to use the result of evaluation in PDCA cycle. In our idea, in planning stage, lesson learned could be used to identify risk and prepare for the risk aversion measures or countermeasures to be incorporated into the project formulation stage. And also in the plan doing stage, monitoring the risk and take countermeasures on daily processes. And also check stage, of course, we have to check what you have identified as a risk for the project implementation. And finally, in the action stage, if you do some countermeasures, and you're sure to have some lesson learned again, and put this data, idea, back in the new usage of the lesson learned. So for our idea, the risk management and lesson learned from the evaluation is unseparated one. It's equal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Joe, do you have any other comments or no? Okay. One of the issues which was raised in the discussion, which perhaps I could ask Bob and Joe to elaborate on, was the how or why would an evaluation penalize or reward project design in terms of evaluation techniques, the traditional techniques which are not very innovation friendly. Joe and Bob seem to have diverging views on this, and I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit more on that before we give the floor to the audience.
No, I'm not sure we have divergent views. Maybe Joe can elaborate. You know, let's go back to what evaluation is. You know, evaluation is about assessing the merit, worth, and value of things. And so to me, the issue of value is what distinguishes evaluation from the social sciences, which tend to be value-free. Not all of them, but not always. But evaluators cannot escape the value dimension. And you know, evoking what we heard this morning from Ravi and others about inequality and inclusive growth, it seems to me that innovation, when we evaluate programs now from now on, we really need to give much more importance to the issues, the social issues. Let me give here a commercial for the European Evaluation Society Conference, October 1 to 3, is evaluation for an equitable society, where we'll address questions of, you know, democratic evaluation. How does, you know, we heard this morning a great deal about the issue of governance and good governance. So what is the role in terms of evaluation capacity development? What is the role of evaluation in promoting good governance in countries? You know, evaluation makes authority responsible. It's at least one of the instruments of good governance. Is this something that is being considered enough? I mean, is evaluation a bit too inward-looking within the banks, within the aid agencies? Shouldn't it not be? Shouldn't we engage our country partners to see what evaluation can do for an equitable society? You know, the other point I wanted to make is that it seems to me there are two different views of management in terms of getting innovation, managing risk, and so on. One is Peter Drucker, you know, management by objectives. And then you have the Deming approach, which is total quality management, which is much more focusing on what we heard this morning about collaboration within the organization instead of competition, the razzle-dazzle thing that Joe was talking about. Each project officer trying so I think the Deming approach seems perhaps to be more adapted to the highly unstable, volatile, and complex development framework we are to deal with today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I don't know that there's a difference either. There's a view, I think, that if a project perhaps has innovative features that are especially complex, there's a danger that maybe the ex post evaluation will not be able sufficiently to capture the complexity, or will try to apply a more primitive set of tools than would be warranted by the brilliance of the design. I don't share that, I think, and I have to say I really can't think of having seen very many examples of that. I think if the evaluation is an honest one and one of integrity, it will proceed by asking a certain set of relatively basic questions about the degree to which resources are connected in some observable way to results and what those results are. There may very well be cases where the clarity of those connections is not as clear as you would like. And I think in those cases the evaluation needs to say that. But there's nothing that I can see that inherently penalizes or would penalize that set of connections, that line of causality. I mean, I'll give you one illustration. Just recently at EBRD, which is predominantly a private sector focused institution. This is a relatively straightforward transaction. It was a loan to a subsidiary of a very large international company, a manufacturing subsidiary. And part of the justification for the loan was, EBRD doesn't talk about development, it talks about transition impact, transition to market-driven democracies. But part of the justification for that loan was, by doing this loan, by investing in this, turns out it was an auto plant, this will cause there to happen very desirable upstream supply chain effects. And the investment in this auto plant will stimulate the growth of all of the subsidiary industries that you would expect around an auto plant. The guys who make the windshields and the tire guys and the pump guys and so on and so forth. And this will be the wider ripple effect of this relatively straight-ahead transaction. As an economist, I believe that. I believe that. I believe that that is, certainly that was what was intended to happen. Probably some of that did happen. But when we went to do our evaluation of this, there were no metrics for it. It was never built into the project design. It was never measured. There were no benchmarks. There was no original data. It was impossible ex post to say with any clarity whether that which we probably all believe probably did happen, but whether in fact it did happen. Now, does this mean that the evaluators were penalizing the project design because we didn't find what we were looking for with the tools that we have? I would say absolutely not. The problem was that the project design was sloppy, and the institution itself never invested the resources either to obtain the baseline data, to monitor it while it was going on, to come back ex post and do a survey, for example, and so forth. So it was simply asserted that there would be desirable upstream supply chain effects without any justification for it. Puts us in a quandary because I think probably everyone in this room would agree there probably were positive upstream supply effects. But we couldn't show that. So our evaluation was conditional. Good loan, bank made some money, the borrower enjoyed it, they're selling more cars. But as for the larger purpose of this loan, that piece of this loan that actually distinguished the transaction from any plain vanilla transaction that JP Morgan or Credit Lyonnais or HBSC could have done, that distinctive piece of it was wholly missing. And I think that's part of what we strive to do as evaluators, is connect the finance piece to the wider effect that at the end of the day is actually the reason why these institutions exist. And if you can't tell that story, I think you're out of business, and probably you deserve to be out of business.
You wanted to say one thing, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Sure, and I'll be very brief. I'm trying very hard to connect the evaluation side with the innovation side. I'm going to complement what Bob was saying about objectives. The evaluations are objectives-based. Project says this is what they will do. They do this. We find ways to measure it or not, as the case may be, and whether we use a combination of qualitative and quantitative means or whatever, but we get to it. Essentially, they are objectives-based. If there is no objective in there which says we will use innovative means to do this, 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 we're not there to evaluate that part. So it becomes a very difficult sell, if you like. Now, Vinod has consistently and constantly been talking about the feedback loops and quicker cycles and so on. We as evaluators could be innovative in those aspects, where you bring in some of these and say, aha, there are things that are happening here on, you don't have to do road project number 7. There are different things that are happening here. Can we learn from this and put it forward? And that can be done at any point in time of a project cycle. So there are things we can do to spur that level of innovation, and I suspect that is the kind of synergistic relationship that could exist between management and evaluation, certainly on the learning agenda.
Maybe you managed to get some disagreement at this point, because I would say that the difference between auditing and evaluation is indeed that the evaluators should look at the goals themselves, the relevance of the goals themselves. There is a perfectly legitimate approach, which is goal-free evaluation, where you simply look as to whether the thing worked or not, irrespective of whether it was evaluable or not. And it can be done, and it's one of the approaches that Michael Scriven, for example, has generated. If I may, one thing we did not mention, which I want to mention very, very briefly, is the impact of information technology on evaluation. That's where the innovation, the big innovation wave for evaluation will come over the next 20 years or so. I mean, you have Web 2, which is how social networking should impact on participatory evaluation, and Web 3, how big data is going to impact on evaluation. I think we really need to start catching up. And I think connectivity to Global Pulse in the United Nations, which is already looking at big data and development, I think it's something that evaluators in the MDBs should start innovating. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to open the floor now to the participants of the conference. If you have any questions, please present, say your name and your institution, and put the questions to the panel. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Farzana Nashab. I'm from ADB's Pakistan Resident Mission. I wish we had someone from IMF. Actually, my question is not related to MDBs or development side. In fact, in the morning first session, we talked about reforms in the countries, and this question is related to that. When I want to apply this discussion of the panel to a situation where IMF comes to a country which is in a balance of payment crisis, it has a standby arrangement program. The program has conditionalities, all sorts of conditionalities, which do not get implemented. Program gets suspended after 2 years. And then both ADB and World Bank have linked their program loans to the successful completion of the IMF program. Those program loans also get suspended for a period of 2 years or something. The country goes back to the balance of payment crisis again, and IMF comes up with another program, say extended fund facility for that country with same kind of conditionalities. Now, when I try to apply evaluation, where comes that? I mean, I'm very confused about it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the clarity on both the innovation and evaluation and the processes. I will have one question that I will rephrase my question I had for the first panel session. And the second would be basically looking to the 12 past years of development and state building in my country. I see that in my country in the last 12 years, innovation was kind of a destructive innovation where flood of resources pumped in, lack of capacity and lack of political will and international community understanding. And that caused in itself not to have a more stage-by-stage process of development. So that gives me understanding that to come up with evaluation environment, innovation, you need an environment where it is needed, where there is a political will and true belief in change process, and simplicity, and you have to be in the right point in time. And if you could clear me with if I'm truly right in this understanding. The question I would have is basically, for the decade forward with the new administration that we will have soon, hopefully in a week's announcement, with shrinking of resources, with international community living, with complexity of the issues, now we see that we are coming in the right point in time to need for innovation, to use the mere or resources that we'll have in hand, but also in terms of the state to build the right institutional setups and processes and principles that would govern the evaluation process in my country. I would be looking for any best practices in other countries, but also what will be those basic steps to be taken toward a more sophisticated and systematic process of evaluation. Thank you.
We'll take a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Steve Groff from the Asian Development Bank. I just wanted to touch on this point that Rakesh left us with and that Joe, I think, put on the table earlier in the discussion about the relationship between management and evaluation departments. And again, I completely agree of the critical importance of maintaining that independence. But how do we, overcome that gulf? And I think that there's always the risk of management co-opting, which we certainly don't want to see at one level. But there's also the risk that, in efforts to increase that type of coordination, cooperation, or synergy, that you end up with just sort of set-piece discussions that don't necessarily lead anywhere. So I'd be interested from the panel to hear if there are examples, best practice examples of improving that synergistic type of relationship between management and an evaluation department that can help inform those of us that are involved in this from the management side for how we can get that kind of cooperation, coordination, better linked up. And I think it's important both from the standpoint of innovation and thinking about the point that Joe made about is there a risk that we're suppressing innovation because of fear of evaluation, but also just making sure that there's clear communication between what needs to be in these projects or programs early on. So I'd appreciate the panel's views on that. Thank you.
One more question. Wow. We'll take one from this side, and then we'll do another round, okay?
My name is Vinay Bhargava, and I represent civil society organization. My question is, what is the best time to do an evaluation? Traditionally, the evaluation is done when something is finished, and sometime after that. So it's almost like, a post-mortem. And associated with that question is there room for innovation in that traditional modality, if I'm stating the traditional mode correctly? Thank you.
Okay, I'll let the panel take the questions. Who wants to start? Joe?
Yeah, thanks very much. I won't try to address the IMF-related question on Pakistan, but Vinay and Steve, in a way, got at some similar issues. But let me get to Steve's issue. I think it's absolutely critical, and I have to say, I come to this having been an external sort of critic of the multilateral institutions from the point of view of a shareholder, having been a board member, having been on management, now from evaluation. So I think there's some perspectives. And it's always been a difficult relationship. And it's never going to be entirely smooth and easy. To some extent, a degree of tension is built in, and that's fine. But there are clearly cases where the tension becomes unproductive and working at cross purposes. I know in the case of the evaluation department at EBRD, independence was achieved in every formal sense. It was stoutly protected by the evaluation department to the point of complete isolation and near complete irrelevance. Relationships between the evaluation department and management broke down completely, and there was a total lack of trust. So any value added that the evaluation department might have offered in good spirit and with rigor is falling on stony soil. So that was a case where independence became a self-defeating fetish. clearly, as Steve says, there's a danger of being co-opted, but there's a middle ground between, and I would offer some thoughts on that. I think first, let's remember to some extent where the need or the perceived need for independent evaluation comes from. It comes from lack of trust. It comes from lack of trust, and it was originally very much an audit function, a checking function. It was a product of boards and shareholders that in many respects no longer believed what they were being told by management. And Bob, I mean, many people in this room go a long way back in the World Bank. I was at the World Bank during the time of the first independent assessment of the Samut Prakan Dam in India, which was emblematic of a complete breakdown of trust between management and the board, and led in many respects directly to the independent inspection function and all this stuff. So one piece is, I think it is incumbent upon management, and I've been part of it, and I know that there are sins, to be more transparent and more systematic about what is intended to be achieved, what is known and what is not known, and don't claim things that you don't think are going to happen. That's one thing. Secondly, I think it's also incumbent on the evaluation departments to have a less obstreperous kind of adversarial relationship. Partly it's about attitude. It's about approaching with an open hand, saying, look, I'm not here to do a proctology on this project. I'm here to explore as a professional what we tried to accomplish, what we know, what we think we should know, and how to best move on. And we're trying to do that at EBRD, but it's a long road. Another piece I would say, and I think ADB deserves great credit for this, is for management to establish its own results unit. For management to take ownership of results, staff a unit, resource it. Whether management uses some of the findings of the results units for internal management purposes, in a way that's secondary. But take ownership of the results agenda, put your best people on it, resource it, and in so doing, I think, become more of a process of getting from the point of resources from donor countries to outcomes and impacts on the ground. The final point I would say is in response to what Vinay said, there is no best time for an evaluation. I mean, it's almost like there's an aphorism about Abraham Lincoln, the former U.S. president, who had extremely long legs, and he was asked by a heckler at a speech, you know, Mr. President, how long should a man's legs be? And he said, long enough to reach the ground. And in a way, you know, the evaluation should occur at the point in which it's going to have the highest value. Unfortunately, you know, we're in a long-term business. We have short-term instruments and we're in a long-term business. And I think here, too, management can play a role in resourcing the longer-term monitoring and supervision of projects, even past the point where the transaction is supposedly finished. So there's a few reactions I hope are helpful.
Well, on the IMF question, it's a good question to address to the independent evaluation organization in the IMF, which also just turned 10 years old recently. And if you look at their conditionality evaluation, you'll find very much very, very independent and tough criticism of some of the practices of the IMF. I think the IMF is in a process of gradual reform in this respect. You know, Afghanistan, I think this was a very important comment question which was raised. I think the best answer to that question is in Ashraf Ghani's, maybe your future president's book on the horrors of huge amounts of flow of aid in Afghanistan. This is a case of what I call trait making, you know, gone wild. With extraordinary, which I think a lot of auditing and evaluation have shown the destructive impact of the aid practices. You know, this brings up the question which came up a little bit this morning, really, how do we evaluate projects in fragile state or in post-conflict environments? There is a great deal of work has been done in this area. I think this is a very important area for the evaluation departments to address. So I really think this is a very important point. In terms of the issue of let me add to what Joe said, which I fully agree, in terms of this independence should not be isolation, and trust building is crucial. I think it's one way. There are many ways to resolve some of these tensions. Resort to external panels can be quite helpful, but mostly bringing in, instead of management evaluation tension, involving the client or involving the civil society in the whole debate. Like IFAD does the decision point meeting where evaluators, management, and the country authorities and civil society are all there to discuss what has been learned from an operation. I think these are the things which diffuse tension instead of having these bipolar tensions that was just described by Joe. It is really quite important to get out of the fortress mentality that sometimes one gets into the multilateral development banks and reach out both to involve the borrowers in the debate and involve the beneficiaries to the extent possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle, and interesting questions. Farzana, I'm sorry, I have no answers for the complicated situation there. I had the good fortune of working on Pakistan when I was at the World Bank, and I thought the situation could only get better. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. I don't think an evaluator can solve that problem. You need much more than evaluations. First, on the question that you raised with respect to the relationship between evaluators and management, yes, independence is important, but I fully agree with Joe, and congratulations to Vinod and team for building up that relationship with the president. I have a very good relationship with my president, who unfortunately leaves next year. So I'm keenly aware that although we report to the board, we have to have a relationship with management to bring about any change and have an influence on what and how this is going to happen. The way I started with my relationship was to ensure that the first few products that go to the president are almost concrete, in the sense that evidence is almost jumping at you when you look at these things. So yes, it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, but we are still proving with evidence that it is indeed a duck. So in these cases, the first thing that I would ask my colleagues is, tell me what you know, tell me what you don't know, and now tell me what you think. Don't go with the thinking first. First, give me the evidence on these things. And I think when you start to approach these and you have a few well-designed, well-evidenced products in terms of evaluations going in, that trust relationship starts to happen. And then at some point you can say, there's a duck flying there, and your president will believe you, and then start to take some actions. Now, there's a dual responsibility here of making sure that you don't start jumping to conclusions either. The question that Vinay asked on the timing for evaluations, I think, again, it's a question of what you're trying to achieve. We recently completed a joint evaluation of the Climate Investment Fund, and essentially, it is what we would call in technical jargon a formative evaluation, which is supposed to inform the design of the GCF. Now, my biggest fear is the evaluation is good. My biggest fear is how is it, and is it actually going to inform the GCF, which is obviously 10 times larger. The last point, which is, I guess, coming and linked to something that was on the policy-based operations, we have consistently, and I'm trying very hard to keep my lens of evaluation rather than operations in here. We have consistently talked about government ownership and so on in policy-based operations especially, but even others. There are, whether it is you're talking of the innovation lab or other means, there are innovative mechanisms for evaluation, whether it is the the bellwether evaluations or the intense period debriefings, etc. There are techniques which we can use to assess truly government ownership. Yet we don't use those. And policy-based operations after operations continues, and in operations documents, project documents and so on, we consistently see strong government ownership exists because of this, but honestly, we know that these are words rather than real actions, and somehow we need to bring that part of it into the equation to ensure that this works well.
Thank you. Shall we go for another round of questions? Ashwani, and then the gentleman behind him.
Yep. I'll introduce myself again, Ashwani Mutu from the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD. Actually, I don't have any questions, but if you don't mind, I'd just like to offer some observations and reflections that the panel might want to comment upon as well. But to start with, I'd also like to just offer two remarks on the question that, or the observation that the Vice President of the Asian Bank made about the tension or the relationship and synergies between management and independent evaluation. In addition to what the distinguished panelists said, which I totally agree with, I think there are two further things that need to be kept in mind, and that is, in my case, I have been in the Independent Office of Evaluation before the office was independent in 2003, and I also have been there since then. And what I saw is that in the initial period, when the evaluation policy was adopted in 2003, leading to the independent evaluation function, we probably swung the pendulum too far towards accountability. And over time, I think we realized that did create some tension, and striking a good balance between accountability and learning in an independent evaluation function, I think, is also at the basis of instilling engaging constructive discussion and engagement with the management. The other thing is, at times, and it might happen more than at times, in presenting their findings, evaluators need to also find the right balance between ensuring candor in reporting and also some amount of constructive engagement, because at times we might get carried away in our language and ways in which we report our evaluation findings, especially if they're critical. But let me move on to the topic of the panel and just offer a few observations on evaluation and innovation. A number of panelists spoke about IFAD and its evaluation system, and the fact that we have innovation as a dedicated criteria that we assess and we rate and assess in each and every evaluation. I think that is very important as a means to promoting innovation, because it keeps the management and the operations on their toes. So that's very important. Number two, as Rakesh mentioned, we have done, in addition to assessing each and every project for innovation, we have also done 3 corporate level evaluations in the last decade on innovation in 2001, 2004, and 2010. And not only have we looked at operations in those evaluations, we've also looked at what Bob called the enabling environment within IFAD to promoting innovations. So we've looked at the culture in the organization, we've looked at HR policies, we've looked at project life cycle and related processes as well from an innovation angle. So that has been very helpful. Secondly, one of the major findings that our evaluations on innovations reveal is that, at least for IFAD, and it might hold true also for the Asian Bank and other multilaterals, and that is, innovation is very closely linked, in our opinion, to scaling up. Because as someone mentioned from the panel, innovation is only a means to an end. And the real test of a successful innovation is if it is scaled up by government, by private sector, by other donors, so that you can have a wider impact on poverty. So that is very important, at least for us in IFAD. And final point is, in addition to ensuring support from the management and working together with the management, I think the support of the governing bodies is essential for an organization to build innovation. In IFAD, for instance, the undertaking of one of our corporate level evaluations was a replenishment commitment. So as part of one of the replenishment commitments, the governing bodies requested the Independent Office of Evaluation to do a corporate level evaluation on innovation. And secondly, the governing bodies have actually included as an indicator the performance of EFAD projects in promoting innovations and scaling up, on the other hand, in EFAD's corporate results management framework. So there is a target for that that is measured every 3 years. Thank you very much.
Hi, Bob Finlayson, ADB. The question I have is actually for the evaluation method. And we've heard a lot about objectives and the need for evidence to back up evaluation assessments. And we also heard President Nakao talking this morning about the need to reconcile this need to try and focus on the achievement of objectives and yet introduce innovation into the implementation and design of projects. So this sort of seems to raise this concept of opportunity costs in terms of how much are we missing out. And this also seems to have a lot of relevance to the evaluation methodology itself, in the sense that we talk about accountability and learning. And at the moment, or the way I see evaluation, it's very focused on these objectives and doing a gap analysis between what the loan document said and what actually happened. But how much work have we actually done in terms of looking at assessing what the opportunity cost is, the counterfactual, and introducing aspects like expert opinion into the evaluation, looking at best practices and forming perhaps two opinions based on the objectives that were stated and the attainment of what might have been possible. It's the second aspect that seems central to learning, and this may also be a bridge to better relations with management. So I'd just like to sort of put the question to you, how much work has actually been done in this area on these kinds of issues? Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a very interesting session. I think it's prize of the day. My name is Ganesh Raunier from Independent Evaluation of ADB. This has been a very useful discussion. In my view, we are missing one side of equation, and that refers to evaluation capacity. In evaluation, we talk about evidence. If it is credible, if it is based on evidence. But how serious are we putting our efforts in building evidence at the country level? I mean, that's a very important element of it, and I would like to hear from panelists your experience, how you are building your capacity, not only your own institutional capacity, but also in your member countries, because the loans, grants are given to our member countries. They are the real owners. And what is their stake? If I may add, underpinning in a question is, what is their stake in evaluation process? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a lady in the back, yes?
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Buenaflor, Community Affairs Officer from the local government unit in a province, southern part of Luzon here in the Philippines. So my question is, some of the panelists today said that evaluation is innovation and evaluation is different from auditing. So my question is, how is evaluation different from auditing and or assessment? In the grassroots levels, which do you think is less costly to be done? You see, I'm from the local government unit where resources is very limited. So considering the very limited resources that we have, we are looking for some mechanisms that are not that costly and yet still effective in measuring the impacts of our programs and projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen, and then Farjana, and then we'll go for a second round.
Hi, Ravi Kanva, Cornell University. I had a sort of a meta question, which came up when I was working with the World Bank's IEG, evaluating the World Bank's role in middle-income countries. In MICS in particular, of course, there are alternatives to these institutions that are represented here and others. In principle, in fact, the institutions are themselves alternatives to each other in many of these countries. There's the World Bank's Asia Department, but then there's the Asian Development Bank, Africa ADB, and so on. And also, the government's own resources are in some sense alternatives. And then in some places, there are civil society and so on. So we pose the question of comparative advantage. And it's a question, I think, that the country should ask itself. And it's a question that shareholders should ask themselves. I mean, shareholders particularly who stretch across different institutions. So it's not just whether this institution is good at this activity A, or even whether it's better at activity A than activity B. It's whether it is better at activity A than the best alternative that's available to the client. That, to me, is the meta-evaluation question. And that is not the question that is being asked, it seems to me, I mean, by design, by the evaluators, because they're institution by institution going around this. So who is asking the meta question in this setting?
Thank you. Just one more question, and then we'll... Farzana?
Farzana Ahmed. I'm with the Strategy and Policy Department, but currently doing a stint with the Independent Evaluation Department. One question that still baffles me after this conversation we've had is the actual definition of what is innovation. I used to very recently manage a country-based community of practice made up of government officials, and they often looked at terms like, good governance and innovation and inclusive growth are sort of fads that were created by the development institutions because they ran out of ideas. And when we were discussing the point of innovation and then the relationship with evaluation, the question asked was, is it ultimately the question should be, are we talking about the best fit for the country at that time? So let's not try and even define innovation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to give some time for our panelists to answer the questions. So I'll give the floor to you, Bob.
Well, yes, I would like to come back to this, always this question about accountability and learning. I mean, to me, they are the two sides of the same coin. I mean, we essentially are focusing on whether the institution is accountable for learning and learning to be accountable. I think to make a distinction between the two, I think is really neither here nor there. But there is an optimum level of independence, which is not maximum independence. I mean, there's an optimum level of noise. If there is no noise at all, then I think you ought to worry about whether or not you have a decent evaluation department. But if you have too much noise, the case that Joe mentioned, then also, so it's a way, it is a U-curve that you have to play around with. And in this connection, corporate level evaluations, which really essentially focus on accountability for learning, I think are very important and are neglected, it seems to me, in many evaluation departments. We tend to focus only on operations, even though the theory of change, or rather the theory of action, which was Joe was mentioning earlier, really is defined by the human resource policies, the budget policies, and the whole incentive framework that we heard about this morning. So I really would urge the evaluation departments to focus more on corporate level evaluation to assess this question. The other question which was raised, had to do with evaluation capacity development, I think this is the next frontier that we really need the current approach to evaluation capacity development really is not working, because essentially you are training people, but the demand side, so to speak, the institutional side in the country, one needs to analyze, how does evaluation fit in to the governance of that country, and what is the optimum level of evaluation, what pathways, what entry points do you use to make a difference. There is some work being done by the FID in this area that I could share with you if you are interested. In terms of the meta question, which is a very good question that we raised, I think there is a concept of strategic selectivity, which I think in IEG we looked at when we looked at comparative advantage issues, and I think it is a criterion which, in addition to instrument selectivity, because you can use projects or programs or budget support and so on, so criteria for how to evaluate comparative advantage can be done to some extent within an organization. But the question that you're raising, Ravi, has also to do how to look at meta-evaluation in the sense of all the various, particularly now with the proliferation of aid givers, we have very much a chaotic and very fragmented aid architecture. And I think the answer to that really has to be done at the country level, namely is the country which has to evaluate where to go, where to shop, so to speak. And so we should also focus on evaluation capacity development to evaluate all aid, not simply institution by institution. And there is also a notion that perhaps we need to have a central evaluation unit for all the MDBs, at least to do peer review or the equivalent of peer review of all the agencies, because the peer review system which the ECG has set up essentially is not functioning because the boards are resisting it. So I think the board of governors, it seems to me, should be thinking about how to ensure that evaluation is being done across the board, and perhaps one could then do evaluation of the entire system on a selective basis. On the counterfactual question, which I think this is the crux of evaluation, how to do counterfactual, I think we need to have a workshop on this. I think we cannot deal with it now, but I think there are methods to try to figure out counterfactuals. Thank you.
Rakesh and then Joe.
Thank you, Rachel. And Bob is the rock star of evaluation in my eyes. So when I disagree with him, I disagree very gently, but I'm going to disagree right now. This is on the question of evaluation capacity building in countries, the question that you asked. And Vinod and I were together at the World Bank when we set up an institution called CLEAR, which is for training of trainers. It's grant financed and essentially has centers in each continent, and they do the training of trainers. What we have done separately in the African Development Bank, and this was a hard sell, believe it or not, because my assumption going into the board was this would be easy, but it turned out to be much harder. The argument was that it makes much more sense for us to be strengthening the capacity or systems, evaluation systems in countries, which would then influence the entire public investment program, not just the small component, which is less than 5% in almost every case of the entire public investment program. In any case, after a lot of discussion, we managed to get clearance on a pilot program. We did get some grant funding from Finland, and they picked 2 countries, Tanzania and Ethiopia. What we're doing there is we've just finished a 3-week training program for 10 evaluators from each of the countries. The next part is doing a country strategy evaluation and it'll be led by team members from our side, but it will also include members on the other side. So in the case of Tanzania, 3 evaluators who've gone through the program there join the team, and then they do the country strategy evaluation. Subsequently, we are doing an impact evaluation on rural water, and then different evaluators will join there. And then final component is a few of the evaluators from there will come and join us in Abidjan, and they will work with us for a month on something else which is related to evaluation, whether it's cluster evaluation or project evaluation or whatever. So essentially, we're trying to combine in the classroom learning with on-the-job training to see how we can have a joint impact on some of these. The question that you asked, Ravi, on this meta, I don't know. It's a critical question. And as we know, there's been a lot of discussion back and forth on should there be a supra-evaluation body which looks at all of the MDBs. How will that impact learning in a sense? And how can we ensure? Because the independence will be great. The accountability will also be great, and your meta question will be answered, but will the learning component suffer so much that influencing and bringing about change becomes almost impossible? So I don't know, I think Bob mentioned that this is again on the agenda. It may well be with a good idea to have some scope for this meta body to look at some of these kinds of things. The last one, Catherine, you had asked about auditing versus evaluation. In my simple mind, auditing is ensuring that whatever objectives are being achieved, the focus is on compliance with existing policies and procedures. In evaluation, we look at that, but also question the existing policies and procedures because things may be, I mean, you could have changes on those policies and therefore bring about the impacts in a different way.
Joe, and then Keiichi, and then we'll close the session.
Thank you. No, I've abused your patience, so I'll be very quickly. Two points. One of the realities is that evaluation is a shared responsibility between management and the evaluation department and the board. And all too often in these institutions, and this gets a little bit to the point that Steve made, evaluation is seen as something that somebody else does. And when the truth is, in order for it to be done well, there needs to be shared responsibility across the institutions. One of the first things I did when I got to the EBRD, I looked with horror at an 85-page evaluation policy. I'm sure no human being had ever even read it, let alone following it. We got rid of it. We now have 10 pages, double-spaced, and one of the salient sort of features of that was it allowed us to have an extended, focused conversation with management and the board about roles and responsibilities. Who is responsible for what? And now it's in the policy. And it had a very salutary effect also at building the trust that we talked about. So that's one thing. On Ravi's meta question, I just make 2 points. One is, to some extent, some of the focus on the part of the donors and the shareholders around results has been in part around some desire that if each institution is producing its results, then we can hold them all to account. And we can decide, who is better at doing roads in Africa? Is it the World Bank or the African Bank? And that's worthy at one level, but it feels to me like it has had, to some extent, some perverse results, where the institutions feeling themselves threatened in their standing in the eyes of the donors, then they're not really as candid as you might like them to be. So I think it's a good idea, but in practice it's difficult to accomplish. Final point I would leave you with is a question. In addition to the proliferation of multilateral institutions, we have all the bilaterals, and they're all doing the same thing. And now, in addition to that, one of the striking developments recently is the development of yet new special purpose funds and yet new dedicated philanthropic agencies like the Gates Foundation. And I think we should ask ourselves, why do these things exist? Why does the global community feel the need to create a special purpose fund to put needles into little kids' arms? And I'm convinced that it's because they believe that the existing architecture and institutions are not serving effectively. So perhaps it should be a bit of a wake-up call to us. Thanks.
Okay, Keiichi?
Since the time is almost ending time, so I just want to react about the capacity development issue. It was agreement of Paris Declaration, and also the Busan Agreement also highlight the need for the capacity development for the evaluation for the recipient country. For Japanese government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs hosts the regional evaluation seminar every year in Asian region. Last year it took place in Manila, Philippines, and this year in December, the ministry is planning to host a seminar in Kuala Lumpur. For JICA, as a bilateral organization, we have currently set up a project in collaboration with the Nepali government in order to foster their capacity of the evaluation. And also the Japanese Evaluation Society is promoting to create Asian evaluation society in each country. I understand that the society has already established in Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and maybe in Philippines also. And we are trying to support the activity too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before thanking the panelists for their contributions and their insights, I just wouldn't try to sum up all the ideas that were placed on the table before us today. I would just like to try and sum up by saying that the purpose of the session was to talk about innovation, evaluation, see the links between the two, how one can promote, enhance, reinforce the other, or detract from it. And many, many issues were put on the table. The one or two that I take away, which particularly jumped out at me, were that one, evaluation should continue trying to do what it set out to do and what its role is, but that doesn't mean that it should be complacent and just continue doing business as usual. It should also seek to improve itself. Two points that were raised, which I thought particularly interesting and would warrant further discussion over coffee, I guess, are evaluation techniques could be learned from the private sector, and that evaluation departments need to be more outward-looking. The other important issue being relationship with management, boards, and evaluation departments, which I think all of us as evaluators experience on a daily basis. I think those are very important issues. We could go on forever, but there is a program that we have to adhere to. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm sorry if there were questions which couldn't be answered, but maybe next time. Thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon.